Advanced Bean Validation Concepts and Examples. This chapter describes how to create custom constraints, custom validator messages, and constraint groups using the Java API for Java Beans Validation. Bean Validation. The following topics are addressed here: creating custom constraints, customizing validator messages, grouping constraints, creating custom constraints. Bean Validation defines annotations, interfaces, and classes to allow developers to create custom constraints, using the built-in constraints to make a new constraint. Bean Validation includes several built-in constraints that can be combined to create new, reusable constraints. This can simplify constraint definitions by allowing developers to define a custom constraint made up of several built-in constraints that may then be applied to component attributes with a single annotation. Example 47-1. The email constraint. Pattern. List. Pattern regexp equal az0-9. And plus. Equal. Plus az0-9. And plus. Equal. Plus. az0-9. az0-9 az0-9. Plus az0-9. az0-9 az0-9. Constraint validated by equal. Documented. Target element type. Method element type. Field element type. Annotation type element type. Constructor element type. Parameter. Retention policy. Runtime public. Interface email string message default invalid. Email. Class. Groups default. Class. Extends payload. Payload default. Target element type. Method element type. Field element type. Annotation type element type. Constructor element type. Parameter. Retention policy. Runtime. Documented. Interface list email value. This custom constraint can then be applied to an attribute, email protected string email. Customizing validator messages. Bean Validation includes a resource bundle of default messages for the built-in constraints. These messages can be customized and localized for non-English speaking locales. The Validation Messages Resource Bundle. The Validation Messages Resource Bundle and the locale variants of this resource bundle contain strings that override the default validation messages. The Validation Messages Resource Bundle is typically a properties file, validation messages, properties, in the default package of an application. Localizing validation messages. Locale variants of validation messages. Properties are added by appending an underscore and the locale prefix. For example, the Spanish locale variant resource bundle would be validation messages S. Properties. Grouping constraints. Constraints may be added to one or more groups. Constraint groups are used to create subsets of constraints, so only certain constraints will be validated for a particular object. By default, all constraints are included in the default constraint group. Constraint groups are represented by interfaces. Public interface employee, public interface contractor. Constraint groups can inherit from other groups. Public interface manager extends employee. When a constraint is added to an element, the constraint declares which groups that constraint belongs by specifying the class name of the group, interface name, and the group's element of the constraint. Not null groups equal employee. Class phone, work phone. Multiple groups can be declared by surrounding the groups with angle brackets and then separating the group's class names with commas. Not null groups equal employee. Class contractor. Class phone, work phone. If a group inherits from another group, validating that group results in validating all constraints declared as part of the supergroup. For example, validating the manager group results in the work phone field being validated because employee is a super interface of manager. Customizing group validation order. By default, constraint groups are validated in no particular order. There are some cases where some groups should be validated before others. For example, in a particular class, basic data should be validated before more advanced data. To set the validation order for a group, add a javax.validation group sequence annotation on the interface definition, listing the order in which the validation should occur. Group sequence default. Class, expensive validation group. Class public interface full validation group. When validating full validation group, first the default group is validated. If all the data passes validation, then the expensive validation group is validated. If a constraint is part of both the default and expensive validation groups, the constraint is validated as part of the default group, and will not be validated on the subsequent expensive validation group pass.